getting the breweries open and getting Americans back to work and getting tax dollars back into the Treasury. And one of his first acts in office was to say to Congress, I want a beer bill and I want it now. And the beer bill was passed in March 1933, and beer came back to America at midnight on April 7th, 1933, before repeal. The 18th was not repealed for another 6 months.
The notion of limiting and in some cases prohibiting the consumption of alcohol in America goes back to the 18th century. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a very prominent figure both in the politics of the time and in the social life of the time, was a very much of an advocate of temperance. Now, temperance, its meaning changed over the years, and through the 19th century's various movements toward cutting down on alcohol consumption rose to more public prominence. Temperance eventually became absolute prohibition. Temperance was not drinking carefully. Temperance became being bone dry, as the term goes. There were several movements in the 19th century. They reached their peak in 1851 when the state of Maine passed a law prohibiting the sale of alcoholic beverages. And that triggered a big boom in prohibition through the 1850s. The Civil War took people's minds off of that, and it then arose again in the late 1870s and early 1880s, building to the pinnacle of the passage of the 18th Amendment in the late 1910s. The prohibition movement largely was about distilled beverages, about ardent spirits, as they were called, about hard liquor. And in fact, the brewers in the late 19th century really represented themselves as providing a healthful beverage, that some of them actually called it liquid bread, as to distinguish themselves from the hard liquor manufacturers. And one of the reasons why Prohibition passed is that these two groups, which together might have had the political power to stop it, they were at war with each other. As soon as the brewers saw that Prohibition was coming, they divorced themselves from the distillers, hoping that they could survive the onslaught of this moral crusade, and of course they did not. When police authorities would seize people moving beer in kegs, one of the first things they would do is call the newspapers, have the newspapers come over, and then maybe they would find a couple women from the WCTU and give them axes or hatchets and have them split them open. That was very good for the newspapers. What happened to those kegs more often is that they were sold on the black market to somebody else, and somebody else in the neighborhood got their beer anyway. By 1925, there are full-scale breweries operating all over the country, particularly major cities, illegally, but with the protection of paid-off police and other authorities. Really big breweries. Everybody saw, here's the brewery, and here's the beer, and it was somehow not stopped because somebody was being paid off. The Prohibition enforcement force was extremely corrupt. It was very easy to take a man who was making $1,500 a year, the equivalent today of maybe $22,000, $25,000, and make him suddenly a lot better off if you just, close an eye when our trucks go by. One of the odd parts of the role of the brewers in fighting Prohibition was how they found themselves supporting something they had originally opposed. There was a tax put on beer during the Civil War. It went away briefly and then it came back. And of course the brewers didn't like the idea of being taxed, until they realized in the first decade of the 20th century that the taxes were essential to the operation of the government. And they could make the case then that, well, if you eliminate beer, and the distillers said the same thing, then you are taking away all this revenue from the government. What they weren't prepared for was the Income Tax Amendment, which came in 1913. And had there been no Income Tax Amendment, there would have been no prohibition because the government would not have been able to function without the money that came from the sale, the tax on beer and liquor.
My story as a home brewer goes back to my college days in 1970. I was going to the University of Virginia. When I graduated, I moved out west to Boulder, Colorado, and that's where I've landed, and that's where I still live. And word got around in my early days in Boulder that I knew how to make beer. And I was asked to teach beer making classes. And over a 10-year period, I taught over 1,000 people how to make beer. The legality of home brewing goes back to Prohibition days. After Prohibition, there was a group of people that lobbied and successfully changed the law to permit wine and beer to be brewed at home, but through a clerical error, from what I understand, through a clerical error, the words "and beer" got left off of that legislation. And so wine was legalized, but beer never was, because it was illegal. Quality information was not available. So people were just brewing beer passed on from their grandfather's recollection of how they thought it was being made. And also quality ingredients were readily available, obviously, because the whole process was illegal. So people were making beer in their bathtubs. There was a group that lobbied in the late 70s and successfully introduced legislation, which was eventually passed in 1978, signed into law by President Carter in February of '79, that legalized home brewing in the United States. Before 1978, when we were discovering that these small breweries were popping up here and there, we referred to them as small breweries. There was a friend of mine and a staff writer for our magazine that also worked for the microcomputer industry, which was just emerging at that time as well. And he kind of was covering these small brewers, and he said, you know, the more I interview these people and relate to them, it's kind of like the microcomputer business that I'm in. These are kind of like microbreweries. And he said it there. He said it. And we said, that's kind of a nice way to look at them.
The extreme beer movement, narrowly defined, tends to refer to those brewers who are pushing the limits of brewing in two directions: high alcohol and high hops, high bitterness. I prefer to expand it a little bit, but you know, within those constraints, there have been a group of lads who are scaling impossible heights of hop bitterness, and some of them successful, and some of them with kind of enamel peeling results in your mouth.
Yeah, the nose, you fall off the back of your chair, you go, punk.
Now, what they've done is push the limit of what is interesting. I mean, a lot of the very extreme highly hopped beers, which are now being given names like double IPA, they had to think of some category for these things because they're wildly out of balance for old-fashioned categories, but they have new style definitions all their own.
And then furthermore, we've developed this whole concept of artisanal brewing, which is a very refined, cultured way of saying, here's what the hell I'm going to make. And I'm just going to try this. If it works, I'm going to sell it. If it doesn't, I'm going to throw it out.
The beers that are aiming to be high alcohol aren't just about high alcohol. If you talk to someone like Jim Cook at Boston Beer, his company has created the highest alcohol beer on record now in Utopias, which is about 25%. It also sells for $100 a bottle, and as Jim will say,
just like cognac.
It's a lovely
beautiful
beer. It's a totally still beer, beautiful. You drink about that much in a snifter, and it pushes the boundaries of what you can say. That's what extreme beer is. Extreme beer is the beer that stretches the definition of beer. So the first forays were alcohol and hops. But the other areas where they're stretching it is wild ingredients. You know, Sam Colagione at Dogfish Head puts St. John's wort in some of his beers. people brewing with coffee, people brewing with infusions of this and that. So strange ingredients with chocolate, real chocolate, instead of simply chocolate notes, which is what you'll get in a stout.